Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. We are discussing the ancient Greeks. We've already mentioned, of course, about the Greeks during the Bronze Age and during the Dark Ages. We've had a lecture focused on the city-state of Athens. And now we're going to turn our attention to another city-state that existed on the Greek mainland, the city-state of Sparta. Ms. Moxery will enlighten us about Spartan practices. They were extremely unique. The Spartans were very different from other Greek city-states, not only in their government, but also in their way of life, totally different from Athens. And Athens and Sparta were not terribly far from each other, their location. Sparta actually is located on the Greek Peloponnesus, which is the very southern part of Greece, and it was landlocked. So we have a lot of agriculture taking place in this city-state of Sparta. In fact, the Spartans, of course, one thing that makes them unique is their focus and their drive as far as the military is concerned. That was their life. The Spartans from birth, even before you were born, focused on the military, focused on strength and dedication. Even Spartan mothers would say it's best for their sons to come back laying on their shields than carrying their shields. Of course, if they're laying on their shields, it means they have passed away, especially if it's coming back from battle. You do not surrender in Spartan society. That is just a disgrace. So obviously, these people still need to eat. So Ms. Moxery will talk about there's a group of people that will be enslaved by the Spartans in the surrounding area, known as the Messenians. They'll call them the Helots or the Helots. I heard it said different ways. And these people would work the fields. These people would provide the food for the Spartans because the Spartans, of course, are focused on their military. Now, there are a lot of other unique characteristics about Sparta that you'll hear about in this upcoming lecture from Ms. Moxery. One, of course, is their government. They didn't have a democracy like we saw in Athens developing. The Spartans had more of what's called an oligarchy. An oligarchy means government by a few. They had kings. They actually had two kings. And, one job for the king was to lead them in battle. And they did fight, even though they were culturally isolated. At times, I'd mentioned this in the past, but the city-states here on the Greek mainland would sometimes be friends and sometimes be enemies. And in some upcoming lectures, we'll talk about some of the wars that took place to give you that very example. The Persian Wars, where they fought together, and the Peloponnesian War, where they actually fought against each other. Of course, some other interesting aspects about Sparta is their council. Their council consisted of some older gentlemen. In fact, 60 years of age was a very important mile marker for Spartan society and other societies as well, not just in Sparta. They are the ones that made a lot of the decisions and the laws. There was a practice in Sparta that some admired later in history, and actually some people still do today, by the way, in modern times, and that is basically deciding which child would live and which child would die. Deciding the fate of newborn infants. If a child was sickly or if a child was born and there was something wrong with it, that child did not fit into Spartan society and Spartan culture. They were not strong. That child was not the ideal of what the Spartans wanted. And so there was this council of older men that would decide the fate of these newborn babies. And of course, a lot of times if they were not fit to become part of Spartan society, they would leave these infants to die of exposure. That was one way they took care of that. It was definitely, I've said it in the past, other lectures, other classes, survival of the fittest. And that was definitely a Spartan measure right there. Still have people doing this in today's modern times in society, deciding the fate of newborns. And sometimes deciding, you know, girl or boy child is more, girls aren't as wanted in some societies in modern times as, of course, male babies. Now, you'll hear a lot about how Spartans grow up and what their life was like in this very rigid, isolated culture. It's very interesting to see how definitely no nurturing involved here. In fact, even women in Spartan society are focused on the state of Sparta and the military state, and their primary job is not to raise their children with loving and care and nurturing, but to produce strong sons that will fight in the Spartan military. So we'll hear more about their role and their status in Spartan society as well. So this will give you a definite opposite view of the city-states. I had said that they develop differently, especially because of the mountainous area of the Greek mainland. They identify themselves with their own city-states or their polis. We've heard that term before in past lectures. And so let's find out from Ms. Moxery a little bit more about the Spartans.
Sparta. Now, Sparta is a very, very interesting culture. Now, I'm talking ancient Sparta here. I'm talking the ancient warrior society that was shown in this movie called The 300. But I don't want you to think that it was exactly like that movie, because Hollywood has a way of turning things into fantasy and not doing things historically accurate, as we hopefully all know. But first of all, I want to kind of do a quick comparison between Sparta and ancient Athens. I'm going to mention just a little something about Athens first so that we can see the difference, the big difference or differences between Sparta and Athens in the ancient Greek world. First of all, Athens is going to be a creative, artistic, and very exciting place. You're going to have a number of people who are going to excel in a number of cultural activities. Now, Athens will also be creating what we would call a democracy. But Sparta, those Spartans, they are going to create a strict, very militaristic, and we might even say repressive society. And in Sparta, we're going to also see that culture, like what was taking place in Athens, is going to be, we could say, frowned upon. Frowned upon, and of course, we'll mention something about that again a little bit later. But for now, we want to tell you also that Sparta is considered by many historians an exception to the, shall we say, political evolution of the Greek city-states. Sparta is going to be similar yet different. She's going to be so different that she definitely will be standing out. Okay, again, while democracy was on the rise in Athens, we have the government in Sparta developing into what many historians would call an oligarchy. So in a few moments, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the government of ancient Sparta. But briefly, I want to mention that oligarchy means pretty much government in the hands of a few. Anyway, so Sparta is going to evolve differently from Athens. War. A word that excites or disgusts people. But for the ancient Spartans, I would say, would excite them. Because war becomes the center of Spartan life. And war will be the basis, we could say, of Sparta's social and political structure. So, boy, for a lot of people, they're going to be saying to themselves, I want to hear more about Sparta. So let's just tell you what's going to happen, and then we will tell you how we get there. For example, at the end of the Archaic period, which was around 500 BC or so, Sparta is going to have a small class of warriors who are going to end up ruling a vast population of people we call helots, serfs, if you will. Oh, and we're going to find out in a few minutes how these poor serfs, helots, are going to be treated. And the Spartans, are going to be able to control these people through what I would call terror. Not only terror, but ritualistic murder. Terror and ritualistic murder. So right now it sounds like, ooh, for some people, I don't know about this Spartan society. Well, we're going to tell you more about it on what some people would call a positive side. Sparta is going to develop what many would call the best army in Greece. Now remember, Greece consists of city-states, and they're like separate governmental entities in and of themselves. So Sparta is going to create a professional army that will be, I guess you could say, the envy of other Greeks and other cultures as well. So Sparta's going to create what many would call the best army in Greece, but this is going to come at a high cost. A high cost for not only the helots, those poor serfs that we'll talk about more in a moment, but also in many ways a high cost for the Spartan people themselves, the people who are considered the upper class. So we need to find out, how did Sparta become virtually a military state? How did that happen? So let's take a brief look at that. Let's take a look at the background as to how this came to be. Then we're going to take a much closer look at Spartan society. We're going to look at the politics, and we're going to look at the military. And we're going to look at how the Spartan people lived and what they had to endure. Sparta was located in the lower portion of Greece on the Peloponnesus, but more specifically, Sparta is located in the area of the Peloponnesus known as Laconia. So they're in Laconia, in the lower portion of Greece. And the Spartans claimed that they were the descendants of the Dorians. That's something that they were proud of. They were descendants of these Dorians who were warriors too. But anyway, at first, the Spartans occupied a few small villages. Eventually, these small villages became unified into a polis, or city. And once they became unified, they became stronger. So this is a slow, gradual process. Then the Spartans invaded and took over nearby Messenia. Now, Messenia was very, shall we say, fertile. It was a nice fertile plain, and so they say we need more places to grow our crops, to produce more food. We're land hungry. Well, they didn't actually say that, but we like to say that Spartans were land hungry. So they invaded nearby Messenia, and they needed more land to grow their crops and to feed their people. They justified it, of course. Now, Messenia is going to resent the Spartans taking over and basically forcing them to give up part of their harvest to them. And the Spartans are going to try a similar takeover in an area known as Argonia. But the Argonians are going to fight like crazy to keep the Spartans from taking over. So, in the meantime, the Messenians are going to be taking this as an opportunity. We are going to rebel against the Spartans. So at this particular time, Sparta is in deep trouble. Sparta's in deep trouble. She's dealing with the Argonians. The Messenians are rebelling against them. And the Spartans themselves are bickering. They're quarreling amongst themselves. Spartan society came close to falling apart. But then the Spartans started uniting. The different classes of people. Didn't matter whether they were the poor, whether they were middle class, whether they were rich. They decided to unite and work together and fight these people, these other people, the Messenians, the Argonians. And like I said, for a while, Sparta had to struggle for its very existence. But this crisis is going to lead to radical change. Radical change in the political and social structure of Sparta. So basically what happens is they institute a bunch of reforms. The Spartans institute changes. They are known as the Lycurgan reforms. And these Lycurgan reforms are attributed to a semi-legendary man called Lycurgus. So these Lycurgan reforms are going to be transforming Sparta into a perpetual military state. That's right. War will be the center of their society and culture. These reforms will change her because she was faced with certain defeat and she had to enact changes. But anyway, so the Spartans again united, and you know what? They were able to become victorious. They were able to defeat the Messenians, and they were able to come out, shall we say, the winners, victorious. In the meantime, those poor Messenians are not going to fare so well. What ends up happening to the Messenians is now the Spartans are going to come down really hard on them. They come down hard on them. They confiscate their land, completely confiscate their land, and they dole the Messenians' land out to the Spartans. The Spartans are each going to have their own plot of land that will be worked by these serfs called helots. So, in order to control these people, the Spartans are going to have to become very strict, and like I said, the Lycurgan reforms help to bring about this change. But these poor helots, shame, 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 they're going to be treated not much better than animals. They will be working and producing the crops. The Spartans aren't going to be working in the fields, not now. They're going to be focusing on their military, focusing on protecting what they have now. So let's talk about Spartan politics. Spartan politics, well, they transformed their political system, like I said, and their politics, I said a few moments ago, can be considered an oligarchy. And we'll see why. Even though they're going to have two kings at the top, even though they're going to have a council of elders, even though they're going to have an assembly, it's still going to be referred to mainly as an oligarchy. It's going to have elements of monarchy, and maybe even some elements of democracy to a degree, but mostly it will be considered oligarchy, government in the hands of a few. So, at the top of Spartan society, we have two kings, two what we call hereditary kings. Now you might think, oh, kings, they have all the power. No, no, no. These kings were warrior kings. They were responsible for military affairs. They were responsible for leading armies into warfare. But their authority in peacetime was limited. They shared power with a council of elders, a council of 28 elders, men who had to be at least 60 years of age, but specifically they had to be Spartans, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And this council of elders was called the Gerousia. And you had to be, again, 60 years of age. You had to be chosen to be on this board, on this council of elders, and you served on this council with the two kings. Now, the kings, of course, didn't have to be 60 years of age, but that's different. But they were considered often part of the Gerousia. Who chose the Gerousia? It was the Spartan Assembly. The Spartan Assembly consisted of all male citizens, Spartan citizens. We're not talking helots. We're not talking some other people that I'll tell you about in a moment. We're talking citizens. You're not officially a quote, you have to earn your citizenship. You're born into Spartan society, but you have to earn your citizenship, which we'll talk about in a moment. So 30 years, you have to be 30 years old, at least, to be on this Spartan assembly. The assembly is called by a couple of different names, but sometimes referred to as the Apella. The Apella. Again, we're not finished talking about Spartan government, because we now have to talk about the people who had the bulk of the power. Now, they would serve for a year at a time. They would be people who would be chosen, elected to serve for a year at a time. And this particular group, you know, I talked about the oligarchy, the hands of a few. I'm talking about this group, the magistrates. The magistrates, also known as the ephors or the ephorit, these are the people that called the shots. They controlled education. They controlled censorship. They controlled all kinds of stuff. These magistrates, or ephorit, as we call them, they even presided over joint sessions of the Gerousia and the assembly. They could even depose kings if the omens were unfavorable. And again, these people had a lot of power. Again, they acted as judges. They controlled the secret police, the Crypteia, which we'll talk about more in a moment. They implemented the assembly's motions. They controlled, I use the word foreign affairs. These are the people that held the power. And again, they would be elected to serve a year at a time. So it wasn't like they had permanent lifetime power, but while they were in power, they had the power. But let's talk about this Crypteia thing for a moment. I mentioned Crypteia secret police. Ooh, some of this stuff might sound a little bit like what some of the communist or totalitarian governments might do. Anyway, the Crypteia, secret police, a band of youths, and we'll explain more about that in a moment, who practiced state terrorism. State terrorism as parts of their rites of passage to manhood. Yep. This Crypteia thing could be very frightful if you were a helot. For example, every year, the E4s would declare war on the helots just to keep them in line. Declare war on the helots, and the Crypteia, or secret police, would be sent out. They would be sent out to murder some of the helots. And you say to yourself, oh my gosh, that is just bizarre. Well, remember I talked about terrorism, keeping these people in line? And we'll mention something again about the Crypteia and these young men in just a moment. But in the meantime, the Crypteia would stalk the villages and the surrounding countryside, and they would try to spy on the helots, and they would murder anyone that they thought might be considered a threat to Spartan society. They didn't necessarily have to consider them a threat. They might just say they were a threat. But anyway, more about that in a moment. Let's take a look at this upper echelon of people in Spartan society. People that we call the Spartans, or some books refer to them as the Spartiate class. Compared to the rest of the population, this was a relatively small group of people who were controlling the helots, and we'll get to that in a moment. So the Spartiates, the upper class, the people who claimed that they were the descendants of the Dorians. Now these people, these Spartiates, were the only ones that had political privileges, and only, of course, the men. And you had to earn that right to have political privileges. It took time, it took training, it took years. So we'll talk about that now. So, but once they did achieve their manhood and become full citizens, each one of these people would be able to be part of the Spartan assembly. The Spartans, each Spartan family owned their own plot of land, and they also had helots who worked the land for them. Okay, a little bit more about the Spartans in a moment. I want to introduce you quickly to a middle class. Yes, they had a middle class of people. They were not Spartan citizens. They might be made to serve in the military, but we're talking people who are known as the periokoi, the people who dwelled around, the people who carried on trade, the people who carried on manufacturing, you know, like the craftsmen, the artisans. These were not, the Spartans weren't engaged in crafts and artistic endeavors or anything like that. It was this middle class of people engaging in trade and manufacturing and craftsmanship and that sort of thing. And these, I like to say, these middle class of people, the periokoi, were the only group in ancient Sparta that really had a measurable degree of comfort and freedom. That's what I think, and that's what many other historians think as well. They were not citizens. They did not serve in the political system, but they served a purpose. They could be subject to military duty. Okay, what about those people at the bottom of the social scale. What were their names? What were they called? Well, a lot of people call them serfs, but they were known as helots. They didn't own their land. The Spartans owned their land. The Spartans had taken their land. But they had to work the land like virtual slaves. Like virtual slaves. We now want to talk more about the upper echelon of people, the people that we call the Spartiates. Wow. Were their lives hard? Particularly the males. Were their lives difficult? I would say yes, very difficult. Let's take a look at when a baby was born in the Spartan class. When a baby was born, it was virtually the property of the state. The babies would be checked to make sure that they were not, shall we say, deformed. Babies, they wanted strong, healthy babies. If a baby was deformed in any way, or they thought it was ill, or it would just be put out, left out in the countryside, in the hills, to die of exposure. Yes, the ancient Greeks, among other people, practiced what we would call infanticide. So if a baby was thought to be unfit, it wouldn't be allowed to live, theoretically, because it would die of exposure out in the hills. So far, this sounds pretty creepy to some people, right? Well, what about male babies? Well, it didn't matter if they were male or female. If they were unfit, then they would be gotten rid of. But what about the healthy babies? Boys in particular. We want to know first, what about the baby boys? Well, the baby boys got to remain with their mothers once they were proved to be healthy. They got to remain with their mothers until they were about 7 years old. Once a young boy reached the age of 7, he was literally put under the control of the state. Again, are we talking about the helots? No. Are we talking about the middle class, the periokoi? No, we're talking about the smaller group of society, the Spartans themselves. The boys, once they were taken away from their mothers, they would spend the next 13 years in military training. We're talking military skills. We're talking endurance. We're talking being taught loyalty to the state. It's hard for us to imagine a young boy, that young, being taken away from his mother and sent away to literally suffer. Oh, these boys would be, they would be beaten to harden them for the duties of war. They were taught to endure pain and suffering. They were taught to live out in the outdoors with hardly anything and have to fend for themselves and survive for themselves. To be able to steal food and not get caught. That was going to be a good warrior. To be able to be stealthy, sneaky. To be able to, shall we say, survive the training, which got more and more difficult over time. Eventually, they would start out with certain kinds of training and physical activities, and then eventually they would, over the course of those 13 years, they would be training with real weapons. And yep, you can imagine some of these guys were killed or could not endure what they had to endure, what they were expected to endure to be proud, vital Spartan warriors. But if they were able to endure all this training and survive, at age 20, these young men would be enrolled in this secret police that we talked about. The secret police known as the Cryptea. And what did we say that the secret police did? Well, let me tell you. Each one of these young men in the Cryptea, by the approval of the Ephorate, would literally be sent out into the countryside with nothing, virtually nothing but a cloak and a knife. And they were forbidden to return until they had killed a helot. Wow. Also at age 20, young men entered the regular army. You know, you had to endure all of the training and the secret police initiation, I like to say, like killing a helot. So then they would be enrolled in the regular army at 20 years of age. Oh, and then they would be allowed to get married. And of course, marriages were usually arranged. Yes, they would get married. A young man could get married at age 20, but he would not be allowed to live with his wife. He's not going to be allowed to live with his wife until he's 30. And you might ask yourself, what's the purpose in getting married? Well, the purpose is to have children. And you might say, well, how can that happen? Let's just say that you would get married, and if you could sneak away at night and not get caught and visit your wife for a single purpose, you were a great man. You were a great warrior. So the stealthiness there of sneaking and having conjugal visits with the wife and producing children. I know it all sounds strange to us. Spartan society. So, we're going to be talking about the Spartan women in a minute and how they felt about this. So he can't live with his wife till he's 30 years old? Nope, has to live in the barracks with the young men, with the other soldiers. So once he reaches the age of 30, then he could live with his wife, but he still had to have his meals with the men in the barracks. Also, when a man reaches 30 years of age, then he could be on the assembly. Then he would have earned his right to be a full citizen of Sparta. Anyway, so the wives, the women, Spartan women, were they tough like the men? Maybe not exactly like that, but the Spartan women were physically trained as well. The Spartan women were trained in athletics. They were taught to keep themselves physically fit. Physically fit, because they were supposed to be able to produce healthy, vigorous children for the state. Wow. The women would even endure, like I said, physical training, exercising, getting involved in competitions such as wrestling, foot races, even spear throwing. And this again was to improve their physical stamina and to make sure they would be strong to be able to bear children. So women were encouraged to exercise and remain fit. After all, again, it was the duty of a Spartan wife to have healthy children. So if she took care of herself, then she should be able to theoretically produce healthy children. So these Spartan women, you might say, did they have a lot of time on their hands? The men would be dealing with the military. Believe it or not, the Spartan women had a great degree of control over their households, for example. These Spartan women had a greater movement and greater, shall we say, I hate to use the word freedom, not exactly, but than the other Greek women. Let's say it like this. Spartan women remained at home but had a greater movement and greater power in the household than most other Greek women. How's that? Spartan women were able to own land and participate in business, deal with the agricultural affairs of their, I'm going to use the word estate, that they owned, the land that they owned, that was worked by the serfs. Because the men were busy. The women had to take care of the home front, so to speak, because the men were greatly involved in their military affairs. Spartan women upheld the Spartan values. Did they whine and cry and carry on when it was time to give up their 7-year-old son to send him off to military duty, military training? No, they would be proud. Again, they upheld the Spartan values. They accepted it. The Spartan women, expected their sons to be, and husbands, and other relatives, other male relatives, they expected them to be brave in war. They expected them to be heroes. There are many stories about Spartan women being proud of their warrior husbands and sons and other relatives. There are many stories that reflect that they took pride in their society. But the most famous of these stories about Spartan women taking pride in their society supposedly is about a woman who tells her son to come back to her from war either with his shield or on his shield. And you might say, well, what do you mean by that? Either come back to me victorious with your shield or being carried on your shield, dead, dying in battle. A son or husband or other male relative who died in battle, died fighting for the Spartan cause, was something to be so proud of. As many military families, even nowadays, can relate to that, taking pride in their deceased loved ones that they lost in war. So in some ways we can relate to this Spartan culture. But wow, either come back with your shield or on your shield. That sounds very dramatic. The Spartans were totally dedicated to their military life. Some people say that they're not really the first truly military state, but they are the truly military state in the ancient world that is very, or shall we say, exciting for many people to study. Very exciting for many people to study. Many people are fascinated with this culture. The total dedication to military life was at a cost. It was reinforced by a deliberate rejection of other activities. What do I mean by that? A deliberate rejection of other activities. I'm talking about the fact that they're going to be rejecting many cultural things. But after those Messenians revolted and the Spartans barely was able to win and subdue them, that's when the Spartans sort of withdrew from mainstream Spartan society. And the cultural and we shall say, the cultural activities declined in Sparta after that. There was definitely not, or the Spartans were definitely not concerned with artistic endeavors. For example, these Spartiates could not engage in crafts. They could not engage in trade. They could not engage in any other form of economic activity. They were warriors. They were insecure. I like to say they were insecure too. And you might say, well, what do you mean they're proud, they're strong? Well, there's a certain amount of insecurity there that actually put this in place and kept it there for a long time. To make themselves feel more secure, the Spartans deliberately turned their backs on the outside world. Foreigners were discouraged from visiting Sparta, for example. And as far as Spartan citizens going around and traveling, going to other cities and getting new ideas, well, let's just say Spartan travel by Spartan citizens going other places was minimized. Except if there's some kind of military reasons for doing it. Usually, that's the way it was. If there was some kind of good reason in their eyes, a good justification for it, but they don't completely cut themselves off from the outside world, but they do a pretty good job at isolationism, we could call it. Spartan citizens were discouraged from pursuing artistic endeavors like philosophy, like the arts, literature, no, or anything else that might be construed as dangerous to the stability of the state. No, we're going to focus on military things. We being the Spartans, we're going to focus on the art of war. That's what we're going to focus on, the art of war and protecting what we have. Sparta used its military power to create a network of alliances. Okay, they're not completely isolationists. I didn't say they were completely. So they create a network of alliances and non-aggression pacts with most of their neighbors right there on the lower portion of Greece, called the Peloponnesus. Eventually, this network of, shall we say, alliances came to be known as the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League. And Sparta is going to, shall we say, dominate this Peloponnesian League. And Sparta is going to be able to determine the policies of this Peloponnesian League as well. So yeah, life in Sparta was tough. Life in Sparta was hard. If you were a helot, yeah, you had to be like slaves working the land, and you didn't know if you might get killed by the Crypteia. Fear, lots of fear must have been going through the group of the helots. And remember, the helots are the largest group of people, and they're being controlled and dominated by the smallest group of people, the Spartans themselves. So that's why the Spartans could justify being so tough and so militaristic and so, we'll use the word repressive, very repressive. But the Spartan people themselves were proud of what they had. They were proud of their society. They were proud of their military. Yeah. Life in Sparta was tough, but not if you were a middle-class person, not if you were a periokoi. So, did anybody envy the Spartans? Envy their military power? Oh, yeah. Many of the other Greeks admired the Spartan military power. They admired it, and they would call upon the Spartans for help. As you will hear about in some of the other lectures, the Spartans will be called upon for help. Sometimes they'll say no. But when the Spartans commit to fight, like for example, the second phase of the Persian Wars, the Spartans are going to be assisting, fighting against this huge invasion of Persians. And they will be fighting, some of them fighting to the death. For example, the story of the 300 Spartan warriors that lost their lives fending off the Persians, led by a king of Sparta called Leonidas. Yeah, that was the inspiration for the movie The 300. Leonidas, fighting with his men to the death, fending off the Persians long enough for the other Greeks to regroup, for the other Greeks to prepare. They gave their lives. They served a great purpose. And again, you'll be hearing more about that story in another lecture. But again, the 300 movie about the Spartans, I was so excited when I heard about this movie coming out. I said, oh, I just have to see that. And I saw it, and being a historian, I was disappointed. I know a lot of the young people liked the movie, but it had just a little bit too much fantasy for me. I guess it served a purpose. And of course, there's many aspects of it that are not historical at all, but it's based on something historical. So the Spartans, they're so much fun to talk about, but to live in such a repressive society, to be able to give up your baby at, well, literally baby, I mean 7 years old, that's a baby to many people like us, to give up your son to go away to military camp and be proud of that. I mean, that would be kind of a tough thing to deal with, huh? So again, Spartan society is very fascinating, and it's so much fun to talk about, and I really, really enjoyed sharing some of that with you today.
All right, well, I've always found Sparta very fascinating and interesting, even though it can be a bit brutal, of course, when you think about some of their practices. And as we continue discussing the ancient Greeks, we'll talk about the Persian wars, where some of the Greek city-states will fight against the Persian Empire. We've already had a whole lecture on the Persian Empire and briefly mentioned it, pulling it in. But we'll focus specifically on the different battles and how everything took place and what was the conclusion of the Persian Wars. And of course, we'll talk about the Peloponnesian War, where the city-states are fighting against each other. And of course, this whole period that we've been discussing as far as Greek history is concerned is called the Hellenic, Hellenic, Hellenic period. Hellenic means Greece. But eventually, in upcoming lectures, we'll start to focus on the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic, it's a combination of Greek and Near Eastern cultures. So this Greek culture that you're learning about right now will spread. It will spread throughout the Near East via Alexander the Great, who was actually a Macedonian, but we know him as a Greek. And we'll see how this blending of culture between the Greeks and the Near Eastern culture, how it produces this Hellenistic age. Until next time.